Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're essentially cracking open an intelligence dossier to take a deep dive into a really unconventional U.S. border operation. We're looking at a policy where the strategic mechanics, they're just as fascinating as they are complex. We're going to break down exactly how physical distance is literally being weaponized in modern border enforcement.
Right off the bat, I want to hook you with this massive logistical paradox. Seriously, ask yourself, why on earth would the US government use incredibly expensive long-haul military aircraft to fly Mexican citizens completely over or around their home country just to drop them in Central America? I mean, especially when the Mexican government is totally willing to accept its own citizens right there at the border. On the surface, it sounds completely counterintuitive, right?
Okay, let's dive into the briefing outline. We're going to hit the logistical paradox, explore this idea of the geography of fear, look at how this disrupts smuggling infrastructure, navigate the legal gray zones, and wrap up with the deterrence amplifier. Starting with Section 1, the logistical paradox. Why fly around Mexico? Let's take a look at the seemingly irrational, surface-level mechanics of this whole operation to figure out what's really going on behind the scenes. You've got a really stark contrast in operational choices here. On one side, a direct return to Mexico. It's cheap, it uses short-haul flights or even buses, and requires minimal coordination because, well, the protocols are already set up. But on the other side, third-country removal to places like Guatemala or Honduras. This involves high-cost, long-haul U.S. military aircraft and demands massive, complex bilateral coordination. So the administration is deliberately choosing to absorb these massive financial costs and logistical headaches instead of just doing the cheap, direct returns. They're actively choosing the harder path. But why? Well, that brings us to Section 2, the geography of fear and the deterrence multiplier. Let's peel back the layers and uncover the true strategic intent driving this massive logistical effort. To really get this, we have to look at the absolute foundation of modern U.S. border strategy. It's a doctrine known as the Consequence Delivery System, or CDS for short. The logic here is simple, but it is brutal. The consequences of being apprehended must be severe enough that you don't even try to cross again. This third-country deportation operation represents the most extreme physical escalation of the CDS doctrine that we've seen to date. Let's trace how this built up over time. Prior to 2003, a standard return usually meant you were dropped maybe 0 to 50 kilometers away in a border city like Nogales. The difficulty of reentry? Super low. You could theoretically try crossing again in hours. Fast forward to 2003, lateral repatriation moved people up to 1,500 kilometers away along the border. That made it moderately difficult. But then, starting in 2025, third-country removals pushed that distance to between 2,000 and 4,000 plus kilometers, right across international borders. It takes deportation from a minor 50-kilometer inconvenience and transforms it into a multi-country international ordeal. I really want to pause and highlight this massive number for a second. 2,000 to 4,000 plus kilometers. This is the sheer physical scale of depositing individuals in totally unfamiliar foreign territory. Just imagine being a Mexican citizen, no documents, no local contacts, and suddenly you are dropped in Guatemala City or Tegucigalpa, Honduras. The physical and financial barrier to making it back to the U.S. border becomes absolutely astronomical. And this brilliantly illustrates two distinct planes of deterrence. First up, you have direct deterrence. That's the severe individual hardship of being stranded far away without any local networks. Second is indirect deterrence. The operation broadcasts this extreme hardship back home, which creates a pervasive climate of fear at the community level. The absolutely crucial point here is the psychological payload. Research shows that this climate of fear radically alters behavior within migrant communities already in the U.S. Families start withdrawing from public services, things like healthcare and education, even if they are legally present. It drives chronic anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and it creates this heightened pressure towards self-deportation. The system doesn't actually need to fly every single person to Honduras. The mere knowledge that they could be flown to Honduras is enough to act as a massive deterrent. It amplifies the psychological impact far, far beyond the roughly 23,000 individuals directly affected by these flights so far. Moving right along to Section 3, disrupted smuggling infrastructure and breaking coyote networks. There's actually a secondary, highly tactical rationale for this operation, and it's all about breaking the illicit border economy.
Think about it. Dropping a Mexican national in Central America doesn't just create physical distance, it completely severs their ties to established smuggler or coyote networks. If a migrant is returned just right across the border into Mexico, they can pretty easily reconnect with their smuggler. But by displacing them internationally into Honduras or Guatemala, it neutralizes those ties instantly. The pre-existing transit infrastructure is totally broken. It forces the individual to start entirely from scratch if they want to try making the journey again.
Let's jump into Section 4, geopolitics and legal gray zones. Because all of this really begs a critical question. How is this politically and legally possible when the destination countries aren't even the deportees' home?
Well, here is the glaring diplomatic contradiction. The Mexican Foreign Ministry has explicitly stated that they accept the return of all their nationals and therefore reject these third country deportations. So the U.S. is intentionally bypassing Mexico completely. It's a major geopolitical signal. It shows Mexico that the U.S. has operational independence, and it acts as an escalation warning. It's essentially saying, look, if we don't get cooperation on other issues, we can and will embarrass you diplomatically by circumventing your sovereignty over your own citizens.
So why do Guatemala and Honduras agree to this at all? It basically comes down to asymmetric enablers. Both countries have a really high dependency on U.S. foreign aid. The U.S. holds massive leverage here. We're talking aid, trade, tariff threats, and visa restrictions. Meanwhile, their actual institutional capacity to process these deportees is incredibly low. They have very fragile asylum systems. The reality is that Central American nations accept these flights due to severe coercive leverage, not because they have the capacity to help. Their political ability to refuse is practically non-existent. Legally speaking, the administration is navigating a very tight gray zone. They rely on the Immigration and Nationality Act, specifically Section 241B. This allows removal to a third country if returning them home is impracticable, inadvisable, or impossible. Now, is returning a Mexican citizen to Mexico impossible when Mexico is literally saying they will take them? That is highly contestable. But the administration pushes the limits of executive discretion, leaning heavily on a 2005 Supreme Court precedent, JAMA v. ICE, to maintain broad operational latitude. And this leads to a really fascinating legal strategy. Just look at how this plays out over time. In early 2025, a district court issues an injunction. By June, the Supreme Court stays it, and the removals continue. Then, in February 2026, a district court rules it unlawful again. A month later, an appeals court stays that ruling and removals continue. It is a very deliberate remove now, litigate later strategy. By the time the courts figure out the legalities of due process, the operational tempo has already placed thousands of people in Central America. The physical removals are constantly outrunning the judicial review process. All right, let's move to our final synthesis in Section 5, the deterrence amplifier. We're going to bring all these intelligence threads together to finally answer our opening question.
So why use military planes to fly Mexican citizens over Mexico? Because the pain and the cost are exactly the point. The extreme logistical costs, the diplomatic friction with Mexico, and those vast 4,000-kilometer geographic distances, they aren't flaws or bugs in the system. They are the intended deterrent payload. It is the ultimate expression of the consequence delivery system. It leverages physical distance to create a maximum geography of fear, breaking smuggling ties and forcing a massive psychological ripple effect throughout migrant communities.
It really forces us to ask, when physical distance becomes a weapon, where does the border actually end? This has been Eyes on ICE Investigates. Find more research and articles at www.eyesonice.net.